Well, I spent 50 episodes on Control because I liked how it was lit, so let's talk about how to light like Control. We're not going to reach Control's level. Control has millions of dollars, custom lighting, a skilled team, and I put together these example rooms in a couple of hours out of cubes. That said, we can at least learn the style, the techniques, the philosophy, and some technical stuff you're going to have to know if you want to do it in Unreal specifically. Let's go. So, the most fundamental thing, as far as I can tell, about how Control is lit is that they use the light as an anchor. The lights serve to anchor the player's experiences in the room. Even if the player doesn't consider the light to be notable or important, it's going to end up driving how they move through the room and what they consider to be the center of the room. For example, this thing over on the far side is clearly the thing of interest in this room. If we wander around and look at these sides like we're probably going to, we're never going to get too lost or too distracted because we're always going to be able to come over and look at this. Regardless of how confused we might get at, some dark back room somewhere, we're never going to get truly confused because everything in the room revolves around this source. There is also a secondary set of light sources down here to tell us what the main approach is, and that's generally it. Control just does not use any kind of fill lighting or small lighting. If they have small lights, it's usually the only light in the room, and therefore it's a big light. So even with this, these are probably brighter than Control would have done it. Understanding that idea puts us a long way towards being able to paint with light like Control does. So let's go over a couple more examples of it. If we come down here, we can open up a different room. Here, this one. Yeah, you can save that room. So come on, textures, load in. There we are. So here's just a big room I put together, and it's got a big obelisk in the middle with the light coming down from above. And it's pretty clear that the central feature of this room is this obelisk. The player is not going to go, oh, this obelisk is clearly my destination. But as the player explores around the room, they'll probably visit the obelisk. They're not going to ignore it. But as the player explores around the room and discovers all of the things you've hidden in the back areas, when they come back out, they're never going to feel lost or confused because there is a light anchor. And wherever they go, that light anchor will always draw them back in. It has a presence. It exists within the space of the room in a specific way. To make these light anchors work, they do have to be fairly interesting. It can't just be a blob of undifferentiated light. Even with this, you can see how it's super, super simple, but it's not in the center of the room. It's offset. It's tilted. So it's one of those things where if you come at it from various angles, you're going to know whether you're in front of it or behind it, whether you're off to the side, how far away you are from it. And those kinds of understandings, that instinctual, oh, I can look at it and immediately know where I am relative to it, is critical for these kinds of landmark lighted elements. And over there we can see the way forward, at least in theory. In practice, I didn't actually model it, but you get the idea, right? Let's look at another room. Let's pop on over here to this one. This room uses a very, very basic approach. The idea here is to pull the player forward using lights. So here, for example, we've got this really bright light here at the end. And as we reach it, we can look around and see the next place we want to go is clearly over here. We might explore around a little bit first, but we're going to go over here. And we're going to look in this room. When we turn around, we're like, where do we go now? And we're naturally going to gravitate to the next set of lights. This is very, very basic, and it's not supposed to be the only thing you use. It's supposed to be mixed in with other kinds of level design. But the basic point is that players are going to naturally gravitate towards lights. Even if they don't go to the light, they're going to naturally anchor to the light and go and If they move around, they're always going to be glancing back at the light and saying, okay, well, that's where I am relative to the light. And that's what we're talking about. Now, in this case, you want to be very careful about how you arrange these lights because you want to see your current light and your next light, but you don't want the light before or after that to be noticeable. So in this case, light 1 is fine, light 2 is good, and light 3 is around a corner. We can't really see it. It's not very bright. From over here, if we're trying to figure out where we want to go, the next light is very visible. If we turn this way, oh, look at that. The previous light, not so significant. It's not pointed the right way. It's obscured. With this, you can always tell the player which direction is forward simply by making sure that they can see the forward light more easily than the backwards light. Very, very basic stuff. Now let's start to talk about the technical side. We're going to get slowly into more Unreal specific stuff, but most of the stuff we're going to be talking about first is going to be just general purpose technical stuff. You'll need to know the same thing if you're doing it in Godot or Unity or whatever. There it is. Okay, so this room I built to show you how light bounce works. There's only one light in this scene. It's a directional light coming down through these holes, and it casts itself on the wall. There is no fill light, no ambient light. If there was no bouncing, if there's no baked, bounced light, everything else would be black. We'd only be able to see these. We don't use any fill, any ambient. We don't use any of that stuff. Instead, we rely entirely on bounce light. We can do this because Unreal and almost every other game engine on the planet uses some kind of eye adaptation. In Unreal, they call it exposure. Because of that, no matter how dark a corner might get, your camera will adjust until you can see it at a nice median tone. See? That means that if we underlight it or we overlight it, it's okay. Unreal will reel us back in. This is mostly because Unreal understands that most designers are not lighters. They don't light their scenes very carefully. And Unreal knows that the most important thing in most games is to be able to see the enemy coming over the hill. So Unreal is going to pull every kind of lighting back to a happy medium. As long as there is some scrap of light, Unreal will pull it as close to possible into a happy medium. This is good, but it's also a little bit bad, so let's talk about it. If we're going to be using bounce lighting, and Unreal is going to be forcing everything to a happy medium, we don't have to understand the absolute brightness of anything. What we do have to understand is the relative brightness of everything. So here you can see we've got this gradient where it goes from bright to dark as it moves away from these lights. This gradient is great, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. As we move into narrower rooms, you can see that gradient goes away. In this room, all of the walls are super, super bright. That's because all of the bounce light is saturating this area. It's just flooding the entire area with too much light. The light coming off of these surfaces is the same in all 4 of these rooms, because they're the same size surfaces. But the more space you have to fill, the darker the space becomes. For obvious reasons, the same amount of light in more space means it's darker. This is an obvious and incredibly important part of how bounce light works, because this is what we want. This sort of gradient will mean that when Unreal drags us to a happy medium, we have a big, wide medium with lots of darks and brights and all sorts of fun little differences. We don't have a flooded medium where we can't really make out anything like over here. And that's why it's important that when we're planning for bounce lights, we plan the contours of the room relative to the main bounce surfaces, the primary lights here. These are basically area lights, which will flood the rest of the room with light, and we have to understand where they are relative to the rest of the room so that we can get these wonderful gradients. Now keep in mind the first bounce is the most important, so if you put something between these surfaces and the rest of the room, chances are that rest of the room is going to be quite dark. It's also worth noting that this is not realistic. So in most game engines, especially Unreal, the incoming vector of the light is not preserved. And what I mean by that is there's no reflected bounce. There's only a hemispherical bounce. The light coming down from here is like at a 5-degree angle, like this. Dunk. So there should be this huge patch of really bright light right here. And it's not there. The reason for that is because the light comes down at a 5-degree angle, and then it goes off at whatever angle it damn well pleases. I haven't figured out any way around that. If you know how to get around that, let me know down below, but I think it's a hardwired constraint. Either way, because of that, we can't get those realistic reflected bounces that you might be aiming to get. We have to settle for these more ambient bounces, and as long as you understand that, you can still do some pretty good stuff. You could fake the bouncing that you might want using a secondary ambient light or something similar. Faking your lighting is always going to be a time-honored tradition. So I said that all of this was possible because of post effects, like eye adaptation, and I definitely stand by that. Let's talk about them. To do post effects in Unreal, you just get them automatically, but you're going to want to tweak them. Come down here into volumes and find the post-processing volume. Stick it in your scene. Ours is right here. Boop. There's no penalty to having a very, very large post-processing volume, so make it as large as you want. The only reason that they have bounds is so that you can have different rooms have different post-processing effects. So make it nice and big. The two effects we're looking at are exposure here and midtone adjustment here. So let's talk about midtone adjustment. The basic idea behind this approach to lighting is that the bright lights, the primary lights, they are our anchors, and therefore we need them to pop. To do that, we need to drag everything that is close to brightness down. We need to make sure that these are very, very bright and everything else is not nearly that bright. To do that, we adjust the gain on the midtones right down here in color grading. See? By adjusting the gain here, we can drag those midtones down a little bit and make the bright elements pop a little bit more. Without that gain, we get this. It seems a little bit washed out, kind of overly bright over here. These don't really pop as much. It's just kind of like a wash of kind of too bright stuff. It's not good. It's certainly not control, so we'll bring that down. The problem is that Unreal doesn't necessarily understand what a midtone is supposed to be. I've just nixed our midtones. We got no midtones, but these walls are still as bright as they were. That's because Unreal has decided that all of these walls are bright. They're just too close to the light source, so it's all hammered up at the very top. Now, good news, we can fix this. If we come back up to exposure here, this is where we're going to turn on exposure compensation. This is the default, exposure compensation of 1. That means that it's trying to make the scene brighter. I believe it's 1 f-stop brighter than what you might want it to be, which is fine if you're lighting with that in mind. But if you've got too much bright, you can always drag that down to, say, 0. Now, when we hit play, you can see it adapts and it's pulled these walls down into shadow. Exactly how much exposure compensation you're going to want will depend on how you're lighting your scenes, but the basic idea is going to work regardless. So in this case, we have dragged these walls down out from that overblown bright element. We've made it so that they're distinct from the bright stuff. They're still quite bright, but they're no longer blown out. And if we come over here, you can see that this room now appears maybe a little bit too dark. It depends on our priorities. That said, you have to be careful not to end up adjusting this exposure compensation too much. If you adjust it down past 0, you're probably going to lose the brights. They're going to stop being anchors because they're going to drop into the midtones. So, whatever your lighting standard is, play with the exposure compensation until you find something that works for you. And then drag those midtones down a little bit so that you can see the bright stuff as nice and bright. It's not that hard, right? I hope not. There's a lot of other post-processing you can do, but those are the two easy dials that you can tweak. Let's talk about one more kind of post-processing, but it's not in the post-processing stack. It's fog. So here's a really fast, crappy room I put together to show how fog works. You can see we've got a fog effect. It is not terribly convincing. The idea here is that volumetric light really sells us on the idea that air exists. We might also add in some particle effects with some floating motes or something. But the basic idea is that we really do need some kind of volumetric lighting. The problem is, fog effects are all kind of mixed together with other random crap. So if we go up here, for example, you can see we've got like fog kind of just floating up here for some reason. What's going on? All right, let's go over it. To get fog in Unreal, you are going to need to use the Visual Effects Exponential Height Fog. Just drop it into your scene. Unfortunately for us, it is universal. So wherever you put it, it's going to affect everything in your scene, and no bounds of any kind. So maybe you want to look for something a little bit more powerful or beefy, but for now we're going to stick with the vanilla stuff. I've already got one. Here it is. The exponential height fog will come in looking like this, which is probably not what you want because it's pretty crap. That's why you have to turn it to volumetric fog with this toggle. The problem is it's still bound up in all of this weird fog stuff. So we have to understand the various dials that we have to control how this fog looks. If we look over here at the fog floating in the corner, this is related to the extinction scale. You see that? As we bring the extinction scale up, we get this block of fog. Now the reason that that is so aggressive is because we're using significant amounts of bounce light. Bounce lighting and extinction scales don't get along terribly well, but there are a couple of ways to deal with that. One is to increase the view distance. However, this effect is a little bit it doesn't really go as well as you might hope. And it's very limited. You can only get it up to 10,000. It won't go any higher. And 10,000 is actually not very much. That's 100 meters. So, if you got a room bigger than 100 meters, oh well. So generally, we're not going to want much of an extinction scale. Even 1 might be too high. Maybe it would be better to have it at like 0.5, right? There you go, right? And the static lighting scattering intensity will allow us to change the overall fog effects, as you can see. But clearly, these are wrong. I mean, these just don't make any sense. So we should drop that down to maybe 1. And now our volumetric fog problems are largely gone. There's a couple of little things here and there. But the problem now is that the volumetric fog here in the center is no longer really selling us on anything. It's not really very visible. Good news, you can also adjust how much volumetric scattering you get on a per light basis. Boom. It's back. So all of these dials kind of overlap in awkward ways, and this is very Unreal specific. But that's the basics of the post-processing stuff you're going to need to know if you want a light-like control. If we go back to the cathedral, don't save because I might need to do another take. This actually has a huge amount of fog in it. Can you see all this fog? So you can get a decent volumetric fog effect out of that. It just takes a little bit of effort, and it can be a little bit annoying. Still, the basics work okay. So let's talk about how you actually bake lights, because if you are a newbie in Unreal, you probably don't know. If you're an old hand at lighting in Unreal, you can stop now. I'm done with that stuff. This is for newbies. So when you bake lights, you have to understand a whole bunch of concepts that people might not explain to you very clearly. One of the things you have to understand is that your lights have to be static or where is it? Here it is. Static or stationary. If your light is movable, it won't bake. You won't get any bounce lighting off of it. So if you are looking at your scene and you can't figure out why it's so dark, it's probably because your lights are movable rather than static or stationary. Now the reason this happens is because when you add stuff to a blueprint, like this one, it will automatically get marked as movable, and you're going to have to manually change it to static. Here, let me show you. If we add another light, is that a point light? Look at that, movable, which is obviously not what we want. So if you're going to be doing any kind of blueprint stuff, you're going to have to constantly change things over to static. It's just the way it is. So keep that in mind as you are working on things. Also keep in mind that the stuff has to be static or stationary as well. If it's movable, I don't believe the light map will bake it, and it will only get volumetric approximations, which aren't as good, So try and keep everything static or stationary if at all possible. And if your lighting is really crap, take a look. You probably have something set to movable. That said, even if you've got everything set up correctly, it's only going to bake the lights at the quality level that you tell it to. So if we take a look down here on the floor, we've got these floor panels. And this one, you can see how there's some like jitter here and there. It's not too bad, but it's clearly got some math going on that's not quite right. Look at these. Ka-chunka, chunka, 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 chunka. Oh, look, this one's even worse. Ka-chunka, ka-chunka, ka-chunka. Oh man, look at this one. This one's awful. Look at that. What's going on? Well, each of these floor panels has a different light map density. So if we come down here to the light map section, here it is, override light map resolution. I've set this one to 512, this one to 256, and this one to 128. Now, if you are following a normal lighting procedure for Unreal, this sort of thing might not be too incredibly critical, but with our approach using control style lighting, the direct lit surfaces have got to be really, really nice because they are the anchors of the entire scene. Because of that, you're going to need to manually tweak this stuff. You're going to need to manually pump it up. So we'll go ahead and change that to 2048 and rebake it, and we'll see whether or not that awkward shadow goes away. You're not going to be able to get rid of all awkward stuff, which we'll talk about as well. For example, here we've got some chatter. See that? And up there we've got some chatter. See that? That chatter happens when your light map is really badly distorted. That can happen for a couple of reasons. One is that you might have something that's partway into another object. Another is that you might have something that is not getting very many hits, like just a couple of light beams are hitting it, in which case you might try more lights. But by far the most common thing is that the light map resolution is simply set too low. That said, the light map resolution will always be set too low for geometry shapes. Let's take a look here. You see how I increased it and now it is bearable. It might still be a little bit too chunky. It's really how we want it. But I only changed it on that one. These are still bad, see? So let's talk about geometry brushes just in passing. These are geometry brushes. These are super nice for blocking out levels, but they're terrible for lighting. They have the worst lighting. I don't know exactly what's up with it, but even if you adjust the lighting to be a higher resolution, you're never going to get good lighting off of a geometry block. Similarly, you're not going to get great lighting off of scaled boxes because you're scaling them in all sorts of weird ways. 0.25, 25.75, that's going to end up causing the light map to get distorted. At the end of the day, your best stuff is going to be stuff that is scaled uniformly rather than on different axes and has been properly UV unwrapped, because that will have a proper light map attached to it, a light map that isn't stretched or skewed. So if you see stuff like this, understand that that will go away once you put a proper cathedral roof on this cathedral. And until you do, you're probably stuck with it. Let's see. There are some other concerns here. Let's talk about the basic kinds of lights. There are 4 kinds of lights in Unreal, and I think this is more or less true in Unity and probably in Godot too. The first kind of light is ambient lights. There's a whole bunch of ambient lighting stuff like the skylight and that sort of jazz. We're not going to talk about that because we're not using it. If you do use that stuff, it tends to drag all of your visuals into the same dynamic range, which leaves you with a very, very bland visual. You really want that gradient. You really want some brights and some dark areas like this. Otherwise, it's going to end up looking really samey. So I recommend against using ambient lighting unless you're like on mobile or something. Directional lights are another thing that we use a lot of. I'll just show you. So if we go over here, this is a directional light coming down from above. Directional lights will come down and have a nice, beautiful, even light all across the surfaces they hit. Problem with directional lights is that they are universal. You can't start a directional light inside a room. You have to cut holes in your room to get the directional light in. You can't really have different directional lights for different parts of the level. Also, because you're baking these directional lights, you can't really do a day-night cycle very easily. If you plan to try, you're going to want to look that up. It's a little bit more complicated than you might think. All of these things combine to make directional lights reliable, but very constrained. They often won't be easy to use. There are point lights. Point lights are great. Now, I'm clustering all of these as point lights, and the reason for that is because they all appear to use modified point lights as their basis. So if we were going to go over here again, back into this area, over here we can see this light. It's very square, so you might think that it is not a point light, and you're sort of correct. It is a rect light. But all of these, point, spot, and rect, use the same lighting engine that uses the same light from the center-ish of the light. It does raycasts from the center-ish of the light. And because of that, they all have some of the same constraints and the same use cases. They all have this ball surrounding them. This is their attenuation radius. The attenuation radius is how far the first light cast will travel. So in this case, this is quite large. We're going to have no problems hitting the wall because the wall is well within the attenuation radius. In fact, we could lower this attenuation radius much, much lower because it's not really trying to hit anything other than the wall that's an inch away from it. But if we were to look over here, for example, this light has a different attenuation radius because it has to fill the whole room and it's quite large. If we make this attenuation radius small, we can actually make it so small that it falls inside of the light. See that? This is the light, and that's how far inside the attenuation radius is. Because of this circular attenuation radius, regardless of what kind of stuff you do with the light, it's always going to end up being vaguely circular. So in general, you're going to want to make your attenuation radius pretty big. Problem is, Unreal can only bake so many overlapping attenuation radiuses. So if you overdo it, you're going to find Unreal complaining, and some of the lights will turn red. Those lights won't be properly baked. It's a pain. But, you just have to think about it. You just have to go back and figure out exactly how you want to place your lights and restrict their attenuation radiuses. The last kind of light is a kind of light I don't recommend using. Let's go back to the cathedral and I'll show it to you. So this is an emissive material. It has just a material that has an emissive node and it glows very brightly. But you'll notice it's not letting any light off. The areas around it aren't lit. That's because I didn't tell it to use that for lighting, but we can. If we come down here into lighting, we can say use emissive for static lighting. At which point, when we rebake the light, that whole area is going to be super bright now because it's got a lot of lighting coming in off of that pillar, eventually. The problem is that this is not using the same lighting engine that any of the other lights do. There's something wrong with it, something weird about it. Maybe it's using an older lighting system. Not sure. In Unreal 4, this is not a very reliable way of casting light. You get very blotchy lights out of it. I don't really know why. Feel free to let me know if you know the technical details, but in general I would recommend faking it with other lights that supplement this kind of thing, just because otherwise you're going to get really erratic visuals. Come on, there we are. So, there we go. You can see that this light is a little uneven. It's got blotches. Why does it have blotches? That's so, weird, right? And the same is true down here. You can see how it's got blotches. It's not symmetrical. It's doing some weird stuff. Don't really know what's going on. So I can't recommend it. I won't send the police after you, but I can't recommend it. And that's the kind of lighting. Let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit about the volumes that you can use. There's volumetric light maps and some light mass stuff. Those are all for polish. They're not going to change how your visuals work. So I don't recommend worrying about them until you're trying to polish the way the light falls within the level. Then you can look that stuff up on your own. When it comes to placing the lights, it's far more important to understand the basics of how the light will work and how the bounces will work. It's almost not important at all to actually just, make it a little bit better here and there. So, don't worry about it too much. That said, the light map density is something you should be aware of. So if you see something like this, you're going to want to pump up that light map density. I think that's it. Feel free to talk in more detail down below. If you have questions, I'll try and answer them, but I'm not an Unreal expert, and I'm not a lighting expert. Still, hopefully this is enough to get you started. Have a good one.